Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of sources, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, and give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed.
And today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental, aren't we?
Yeah, really fundamental. That age-old human quest to figure out our place in the universe and, those big questions where faith and science seem to collide.
Right. It often feels like a tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
These two huge ways of knowing are just fundamentally at odds.
But what if they're not? What if that tension is maybe a misunderstanding?
Exactly. Could science and faith actually, enrich each other?
Yeah.
Coexist, maybe even flourish together?
That's precisely the territory we're exploring today. Our mission really is to pull out the key insights from a deeply personal but also really intellectually rigorous look at how Islam and modern science might work together.
Yeah, and we're leaning heavily on physicist Nidhal Guessoum's book, Islam's Quantum Question. It's a fantastic starting point.
He's got such a unique perspective, too.
He really does. I mean, a devout Muslim, PhD in particle physics from Berkeley, astrophysics researcher.
Comes from a family of scientists, too, right?
Yeah, so it's not just theory for him, it's lived experience. He's really trying to bridge these two worlds he inhabits. It makes you wonder if there's a unified path.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And maybe the best place to start is way back, Islam's golden age.
Right, think 12th century Cordova.
Wow, yeah. The jewel city of the world, they called it. Just imagine, it wasn't just rich, it was this, buzzing hub of culture and intellect.
Over 70 libraries, some holding hundreds of thousands of books. It's hard to even picture that scale back then.
A real intellectual paradise.
And that environment, that's where you get these incredible scholars. People like Ibn Baya, Ibn Tufayl, al-Idrisi.
Ibn Arabi, the mystic.
Right, and crucially for our discussion, Ibn Rushd. They were all thinking and writing in this incredibly fertile climate.
So Ibn Rushd, Averroes, as he's known in the West, a giant figure, really.
Absolutely. Born into this intellectual dynasty, becomes the supreme judge in Cordova.
And he's championing Aristotle, the power of pure reason.
Yeah, but his path wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
No, far from it. He faced, serious persecution.
You did. Expelled, exiled.
Yeah.
They even publicly burned his books. It was basically a kind of fundamentalist witch hunt.
There's that movie, Destiny, that portrays it, right? A really chilling moment in history.
Mm-hmm. And here's the paradox, the really interesting part.
Go on.
Despite being persecuted there, his influence in Europe, centuries later, was massive, way bigger than in the Arab or Muslim world for a long time.
Alain de Libra, the expert on Averroes, basically said no other thinker from the Islamic world had a greater impact on universal culture. That's huge.
It is huge. And part of the reason for that disconnect was, some of his key philosophical works just weren't translated into Latin until the 20th century.
So the West didn't even have full access for ages?
Right. And there's this persistent misunderstanding about his whole double truth idea, the duplex veritas.
Okay, clarify that, because it sounds like he's saying philosophy and religion can contradict each other.
Yeah, that's the common misunderstanding. But he never believed that. His core idea, his absolute anchor was truth cannot contradict wisdom. For him, philosophy and science were good things, maybe even required activities, because studying God's creation helps you appreciate God more.
So it wasn't two truths, but maybe two paths to the same truth.
Exactly. He thought truth could be reached and explained differently, philosophy for the thinkers, theology for the wider population, but they both pointed towards the one ultimate reality.
Okay, so that's the Golden Age, an incredible peak of intellectual life. But fast forward to today. And the picture looks, different.
Very different. You see these striking contrasts, like take Dubai.
Right. The tallest tower, Burj Khalifa, that 7-star hotel, it's this dazzling display of tech and money.
Incredible modern infrastructure, economic power, absolutely. But Guessoum points out that alongside that, the level of human and crucially scientific development is described as kind of depressed.
An imbalance then, not just building things, but building knowledge.
Precisely. It's not just about infrastructure. It's about fostering genuine intellectual progress.
And it goes beyond just development levels, right? There's this rise of pseudoscience, too.
Yeah, that's a major concern. A really stark example was that Qur'anic healing conference back in 2007 in Abu Dhabi.
At that same 7-star hotel, ironically.
Right. Over 1,300 people, dignitaries included. And you have university professors discussing healing people by reciting the Quran over water.
Okay. Based on what?
Well, that's the problem. They were referencing scientifically discredited ideas, things like the memory of water or electromagnetic waves or some kind of information content passed on by quasi-saints.
Not exactly rigorous science.
Not at all. And while they quoted Qur'anic verses, mainstream scholars are pretty clear those verses refer to spiritual healing.
Not physical healing, like, say, honey, which the Qur'an does mention for physical remedy.
Exactly. So the claims just didn't hold up scientifically or arguably theologically in the way they were presented. They lacked empirical backing.
You see this kind of priority imbalance elsewhere, too, right, in resource allocation.
Definitely. Like, Quran memorization competitions get, 20 times more funding and attention than science fairs in some places?
And nobody asked the kids memorizing the Quran about, basic science concepts during those competitions.
Right. It highlights this issue with the public understanding of science. Which brings us to that moon-splitting story.
Ah, yes, the NASA photo proof.
Millions genuinely believe a NASA photo shows the moon was physically split in the time of Prophet Muhammad as a miracle.
Even though geologically that makes no sense, and even some proponents of scientific miracles suggest the verses might be about the day of judgment, not the past.
Exactly. It shows a fundamental disconnect with what scientific evidence actually is and how you interpret it. It's taking things out of context.
So what's the bottom line here for the modern situation? What's Guessoum's main point?
He really emphasizes this core problem, a, quote, hugely widespread ignorance of basic scientific facts. But maybe even more critical is a lack of understanding, even among a large part of the Muslim elite, about the very nature of science, how it works, its methods, what it's good for, and crucially, its limits.
It's not just knowing facts, it's understanding the process of knowing.
Precisely. How knowledge is actually produced in science.
And that connects back to why he wrote the book, right? His goal.
Yes. His main aim is to try and build this modern, harmonious synthesis of science and Islam. He calls it theistic science.
Theistic science. Okay.
And his hope is that Islam can, join hands with other monotheistic traditions, especially Christianity, he mentions, to tackle these problems together.
And he warns about it being hijacked.
Yeah, he doesn't want it watered down or misused. His vision is about a shared, God-centered search for knowledge that maintains intellectual rigor, not just coexistence, but real synergy.
Okay, to really get that synthesis, we need to dig into the concept of God in Islam itself. It's foundational.
Absolutely. Generally, for Muslims, Allah's existence is seen as, obvious, almost innate. It's called fitra.
So atheism isn't really the main historical counterpoint.
Not in the same ways in the West. Atheism is quite a recent idea in Islamic discourse. The Quran is mostly talking to polytheists, people who believed in multiple gods, not no God.
And the core concept is tawheed.
Tawheed. The absolute oneness, the indivisibility of God. That's central. Plus the 99 beautiful names describing God's attributes, the merciful, the wise, and so on.
But there have been theological debates, right? About descriptions that sound, human-like. God seeing or hearing or his right hand.
Yes, reconciling those anthropomorphic descriptions with God's utter transcendence has always been a theological challenge. How can God be beyond description yet described in these ways?
And how did the classical philosophers, the ones we mentioned earlier, like Ibn Rushd, handle this?
Well, figures like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Rushd, even though they often got labeled heretics for using Greek philosophy.
Right, blending reason and revelation.
They generally believed that the God the Greek philosophers reasoned towards was the same God as Allah. Ibn Rushd especially thought philosophy was actually the best way for intellectuals to rationally discuss God.
That must have been pretty radical then.
Oh, definitely. And moving to more modern times, you see figures like Al-Afghani pushing for a more rationalist approach to Islam.
Contrasting with more fundamentalist groups.
Exactly. Groups often called Wahhabis or Salafis tend to reject practices they see as shirk, associating partners with God, like venerating saints or Bida's unacceptable innovations.
And they'd likely reject scientific findings that clash with literal readings of Scripture.
Generally, yes. That literalism creates a significant barrier to the kind of synthesis Guessoum is talking about.
Now, there's that incident with Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg lecture in 2006. That really stirred things up, didn't it?
It absolutely did. A huge reaction in the Muslim world. He quoted this old Byzantine emperor making offensive remarks about Islam.
And he referenced a view of God from Ibn Hazm as being so absolutely free, he wasn't even bound by reason. Sounds explosive.
It was. Widespread protests. But it's interesting to look past the immediate uproar. The Pope's main point, really, was internal to Christianity arguing against stripping Greek reason out of faith, what he called de-Hellenization.
And against positivist culture, limiting reason just to science.
Right. He wanted a broader concept of reason, one that includes metaphysics and theology. And actually, in response, many Muslim scholars strongly emphasized the role of reason within Islam, correcting the Pope's factual points, but also stressing the Quran's own calls for reflection.
So, beneath the conflict may be a shared concern about pure materialism.
You could argue that, yes. Despite the very real offense caused, it highlighted a shared unease about reducing all knowledge to the purely empirical.
These debates naturally lead to the core arguments for God's existence. How have thinkers tried to demonstrate the divine?
Well, you have the classic arguments. The cosmological one, there must be a first cause for the universe. The ontological, based on the idea of God as a perfect being.
The design argument looking at purpose and order in nature.
Right, the teleological argument. Plus moral arguments, arguments from spiritual experience. Muslim thinkers often highlighted those natural arguments, especially design, drawing on Qur'anic verses telling people to reflect and observe God's creation. Verses like Q10.101 or 29.2.
But the concept of God itself has shifted over time, influenced by science and philosophy.
Massively. The Protestant Reformation pushed towards faith over reason for some. The Enlightenment brought deism, God, the clockmaker, who sets things up and steps back.
Then Darwinism seemed to challenge the need for a direct designer.
Exactly. But then, interestingly, modern cosmology with the Big Bang seemed to point back towards a moment of creation, a beginning.
Which prompted scientists like Hawking to ask, okay, so what place is left for a creator?
Right. And then quantum mechanics comes along, QM, and sort of shatters classical determinism. This potentially opens up a space, a channel, for God to act in the world without breaking physical laws.
It's this constant back and forth, this evolving dialogue between science, philosophy, and theology that Guessoum is navigating.
Precisely. Which brings us neatly to the Quran itself and this whole idea of its scientific miracles. This is a really big topic in the Muslim world.
The Quran holds a unique place, doesn't it? Almost sacred, like Jesus as the logos in Christianity, seen as Muhammad's main miracle. People consult it daily.
Absolutely central. And that leads to this ijtihad theory, scientific miraculousness. It's super popular, even gets official backing from bodies like that commission in Mecca with big names like Zaghloul al-Nagar.
And then the basic claim is
that the Quran contains scientific facts discovered only recently, proving it must be divine, showing God's foreknowledge.
Okay, but how well does that claim hold up under scrutiny?
Well, Guessoum points out some pretty major scientific and methodological problems. Take the speed of light calculation supposedly found in verse Q32.5.
Yeah.
The verse mentions time, but there's no distance mentioned. To get the speed of light out of it, you have to basically force the numbers, manipulate physical quantities in an artificial way. It's just not there in the text.
Sounds like forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Pretty much. Or take the claim from verses like Q2.29 and 41.912 that the Earth was created before the rest of the cosmos.
Which contradicts modern geology and astronomy, right? We know heavy elements needed for Earth formed in stars after the initial Big Bang.
Exactly. The Earth had to come later. And then there's the moon splitting story again, using that NASA photo. That's just a classic case of misinterpreting evidence to fit a belief.
So what's the underlying issue with this ijtihad approach?
The core flaw, methodologically, is that proponents often treat science like an ideology you can just discard if it doesn't fit their interpretation. They sometimes claim divine origin simply because science can't explain something yet, or they twist scientific data.
It's less about genuine discovery and more about finding validation.
You could say that. It risks harming both scientific understanding and potentially a deeper appreciation of faith by forcing these connections.
Now, there's a related idea, tafsir ilmi, scientific exegesis. How is that different?
It's distinct. Its goal is more about harmonizing the Qur'an with science, showing Islam is modern and compatible, rather than proving the Qur'an had miraculous scientific foresight like Ijtihad claims.
So less about proving divinity, more about showing relevance.
Kind of. Early figures like Al-Iskandarani and Tantawi Jawari promoted it, and later books like Maurice Bucay's The Bible, the Qur'an, and Science made it popular in the West.
But it's not without its critics either.
No. Critics say it can still assign meanings to Quranic words they likely didn't have originally, or it ignores the historical context of the revelation.
This is where Guessoum brings back Averro's principle.
Exactly. Averro's idea of no possible conflict between revelation and sound science. Guessoum argues the Quran has layers of meaning. It's nuanced.
So a verse doesn't have to mean just one thing, especially not just a literal scientific fact.
Right. Take Noah living 950 years in Q 29.14. Maybe it doesn't mean literally 950 years, but signifies a very, very long time, a metaphor for his perseverance.
Or the Red Sea parting.
Could it be understood not as suspending all laws of physics, but as God acting subtly within those laws? Maybe a tiny intervention at the quantum level, or exploiting chaotic systems, creating a butterfly effect that leads to a large-scale, natural-seeming event like winds parting the sea.
God working through nature, not just against it.
Potentially, yes. Or descriptions of embryo development in Q 23.14 or 39.6. They can be seen as accurate for their time, reflecting observable stages, without claiming they contain hidden details only known to modern embryology.
And the seven heavens.
Could mean planets, could mean galaxies, could be symbolic, could even hint at multiverses if you want to stretch it. The point is flexibility. Allow scientific knowledge to inform our understanding without forcing the text to be a science textbook predicting future discoveries. It's about harmony, not forced proof.
Okay, so to get this harmony, we really need to understand science itself better. Not just its findings, but how it works. You mentioned the public often misunderstands this.
Hugely. People often don't grasp how scientific results are established, what makes something a fact, or even basic things like the age of the universe.
So a quick philosophy of science 101 might be helpful here.
Definitely. Karl Popper's idea of falsifiability is key.
Meaning a scientific idea has to be testable, something you could potentially prove wrong.
Exactly. If you can't even imagine an experiment or observation that could disprove it, it's not really science. It sets a boundary.
And then Thomas Kuhn. Paradigms.
Right. Kuhn talked about how science progresses through these big paradigm shifts, like moving from Newton's view of gravity to Einstein's.
But he controversially suggested these shifts aren't purely logical.
Yeah, he argued they involve a kind of act of faith in the new way of seeing things, even social factors like peer pressure within the scientific community. It suggests science isn't always this perfectly objective march forward.
And there are critiques of modern science practices too. Rivette's.
Jerome Rivette's, yeah. He talked about the pathologies of what he called industrialized science. He worried it was becoming too entrepreneurial, sometimes leading to shoddy or reckless work.
He cited examples like unethical experiments.
Right, like feeding radioactive oats to kids back in the 40s. And he talked about the social construction of scientific facts, how societal values can subtly shape what gets accepted as true.
This feeds into that cultural centrism critique, doesn't it? The idea that modern science isn't universal, but deeply Western.
It does. Said Hossein Nazar argues strongly that the definition of science itself is tied to underlying cultural and metaphysical assumptions, and that modern secular science is actually the historical anomaly.
Ziad Sardar takes it even further, seeing science as a tool of control.
Yeah, Sardar views modern science sometimes as an instrument used by the West to dominate other cultures, pointing to things like how few non-Western journals get indexed in major databases. It raises serious questions about neutrality.
So a key takeaway here is that science itself isn't purely objective. It rests on some assumptions, metaphysical basis.
Absolutely. Even physics. 17th century science assumed, for instance, a rational, understandable, objective universe. Today, the strong materialism of much modern science, the idea that only matter and energy are real, that's a philosophical choice, not a direct result of science itself.
It's a philosophical stance that then shapes the questions asked and answers accepted.
Exactly. And that choice leads to worries about scientific imperialism or scientism.
Applying science beyond its proper limits.
Right. Trying to answer questions about meaning, purpose, or morality using only scientific tools. Guessoum actually co-signed the letter in Le Monde pleading for science to tolerate metaphysical and spiritual reflection, not dismiss it.
Okay, so given all that complexity, it's no wonder there are different ideas about what an Islamic science might even look like.
No kidding. You've got Said Hossein Nazar, who was the first Muslim physicist at MIT, really pushing for a science embedded within an Islamic worldview.
A sacred science.
Yeah, fusing the rational and empirical with intuition and faith, where reason is ultimately guided by the heart, by spiritual wisdom.
Then there's the Islamization of knowledge movement.
Right, associated with al-Faruqi. A really ambitious project to basically rewrite all academic disciplines, producing textbooks that align with Islamic beliefs, removing contradictions, adding Islamic concepts.
But Sardar criticized that, called it mediocre.
He did. He felt it often resulted in just adding Islamic labels without deep intellectual change, becoming a kind of vicious cycle.
So what was Sardar's alternative? his Ijmali vision.
Sardar's idea is more about rethinking the purpose and practice of science for the good of all humanity, focusing on solving real-world, local problems like disease in Pakistan, flood control in Bangladesh, and explicitly integrating ethics and human values into the scientific process itself, more practical, more socially engaged.
Then you have figures like Abdus Salam, the Nobel laureate.
Right. Guessoum calls him a conventionalist scientist. Salam saw science as universal, totally compatible with Islam, and felt Muslims had historically contributed to its methods. For him, personal religious belief just didn't or shouldn't affect the research itself.
And at the other extreme, Pervez Hoodbhoy.
Hoodbhoy takes a strong secularist stance. He basically says, science is secular, period. Scientists can be religious personally, but science answers only to its own methods. For him, Islamic science as a distinct thing just doesn't exist.
Wow, so a whole spectrum of views, from deep integration to complete separation.
Exactly. It's not one thing, it's a debate. And it's really important here to distinguish science, the quest for understanding, from technology.
Right. Nuclear weapons aren't an inevitable outcome of understanding atoms.
Precisely. Technology involves science, yes, but also policy choices, social factors, economics. You can't just blame science for its applications.
Okay, let's shift focus now. Gaze upwards to the cosmos. Cosmology, design, the really big picture.
From those older Islamic cosmologies, Ibn Rushd's eternal cosmos, Ibn Arabi's mystical view of the universe as God's manifestation,
to modern scientific cosmology,
which is now a very precise field, studying the universe's origin, evolution, fate, all based on observation and, crucially, that Popperian idea of falsifiability.
And the discoveries have been staggering.
Unbelievable. First, Hubble in 1929 showing the universe is expanding, not static. Huge.
Then finding the cosmic microwave background radiation, the CMB, that afterglow of the Big Bang.
Which really solidified the Big Bang model. And then satellites like WMAP pinning down the age 13.7 billion years. Incredible precision.
And more recently, the acceleration, dark energy, dark matter.
Yeah, the universe's expansion is speeding up, driven by this mysterious dark energy, making up 70% of everything. And its value is bizarrely small, 120 orders of magnitude smaller than theory suggests it should be. Plus, dark matter at 25%, leaving only 4% for the ordinary matter we actually see. These are huge mysteries.
And these discoveries inevitably spill over into philosophy and theology. Why is the universe like this?
Exactly. The Big Bang led Pope Pius XII to connect it to Genesis, seeing it as proof of creation. But it also led Hawking to ask, so where does a creator fit in? It cuts both ways.
This brings us back to that design argument, but maybe on a cosmic scale, fine-tuning.
Right. The old idea that nature shows signs of design. Aquinas, John Ray, Bailey's watchmaker.
If you find a watch, you assume a watchmaker. Nature's complex.
So, a designer. But the modern anthropic principle and fine-tuning are arguably much more powerful. It's the scientific discovery that the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe, the strength of gravity, electromagnetism, the amount of dark energy, are exquisitely balanced for life to exist.
Like if they were just slightly different, we wouldn't be here.
Exactly. Paul Davies said, the impression of design is overwhelming. Roger Penrose did that calculation. The initial conditions needed for our universe had to be accurate to 1 part in 10, the power of 10 to the power of 123.
That number is just meaningless. It's so huge.
Yeah.
Mind-boggling precision.
It really is. And some scientists, like Gonzalez and Richards in The Privileged Planet, argue for even more fine-tuning, specific to Earth-Jupiter acting as a cosmic vacuum cleaner, the moon stabilizing our tilt.
Though that's more controversial, right? Blurring science and theology.
It is more controversial, definitely pushing into interpretation. But the basic physical fine-tuning is widely acknowledged, even if the explanation is debated.
And the main scientific counter-explanation is the multiverse.
Yeah, the idea that maybe there are zillions of other universes, maybe infinite universes, with different laws and constants. We just happen to be in one where the parameters randomly fell right for life. It makes our universe statistically inevitable, not designed.
But critics say that's not really testable science, it's metaphysics.
That's the main critique. It's unfalsifiable. By definition, we can't observe other universes. Some call it a materialistic, desperate recourse, giving up on finding a real explanation within our universe. It sidesteps the question.
It's important, too, to distinguish the weak and strong anthropic principles.
Yes. The weak version just observes that the universe's properties must allow life to develop within it at some point, otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe it. It's almost a tautology, but useful scientifically.
Whereas the strong version suggests the universe was somehow required to have properties allowing life. That implies purpose.
Exactly. That's much more philosophical and controversial.
How does this resonate within Islam? Guessoum mentions a slow response.
Relatively slow, yeah. But there are certainly echoes in Qur'anic verses about God creating things in due proportions, Q25.2, or establishing balance, Q55.7.
And he introduces this concept of task here.
Yes, which he calls an ultra-anthropic principle. It's the Islamic concept that God has actively subjugated or made the cosmos serviceable for humanity. It puts humans right at the center of creation's purpose, in a way.
More purposeful than just conditions are right for life.
Much more. Though Guessoum adds the caveat that the ultimate why of creation remains ultimately divine and beyond our full grasp.
Okay, let's tackle the really sensitive one, evolution. You said it's highly contentious in Muslim culture.
Hugely. Fatwas against teaching it, very little open scientific discussion. Surveys show most Muslims, even educated ones, tend to reject it.
Often with the idea that it's just a theory or that humans are completely separate, specially created.
Right, that just a theory line shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what a scientific theory is. It's a robust explanation backed by enormous evidence, not just a guess.
But the idea that God directs the process, rather than it being purely random, that fits into theistic evolution.
Yes, the idea that God guides evolution, that transformations are ultimately God's action, that's a perfectly respectable theological position within the framework of theistic evolution.
And the scientific evidence for evolution is pretty extensive now.
Oh, absolutely. It comes from multiple lines. The fossil record, while not perfect, keeps filling in with transitional forms Archaeopteryx between reptiles and birds. The detailed sequence showing whale evolution from land mammals.
Comparative anatomy, similar structures, vestigial organs.
Right. Homologous structures like the bone pattern in a human arm, a bat wing, and a whale flipper point to common ancestry. And vestigial organs like our appendix or tailbone, or occasionally even babies born with tails, are remnants of our evolutionary past.
And genetics must be huge here.
Crucial. The DNA similarities are striking only about 1% difference between us and chimps. We can see evidence like human chromosome 2 being a fusion of 2 ape chromosomes.
Clear evidence of shared ancestry.
Definitely. And shared mistakes or typos in our DNA, like the broken gene for making vitamin C that we share with other primates, strongly points to a common ancestor who lost that ability.
We can even see evolution happening now, right? Microevolution.
Yes. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria is evolution happening in real time. Bacteria with mutations allowing them to survive antibiotics reproduce, and resistance spreads.
Or those tuskless elephants, because poachers target tusked ones.
Exactly. Hunting pressure is driving natural selection, favoring the genes for tusklessness. It's observable change within populations.
Darwin's big idea, inspired by Malthus, was natural selection as the mechanism.
Right. Random variation happens, and the environment selects the traits that are advantageous for survival and reproduction. It's gradual change over long periods.
Though there are newer ideas, too. Non-Darwinian mechanisms.
Yeah, some theories explore whether there's an internal logic or programming involved, suggesting evolution might happen in quicker step jumps sometimes, not just gradual changes. These add to Darwin, rather than replace him entirely.
So theistic evolution tries to bridge this, God using evolution as the tool.
Essentially, yes. Seeing evolution as God's chosen method for creation. Many prominent Christian thinkers, Asa Gray back in Darwin's time, Teilhard de Chardin, more recently John Polkinghorne, Keith Ward, embraced this. God acting persuasively, guiding the process from within.
And in Islam, were scholars always resistant?
Interestingly, no. Early 20th century Muslim scholars were often more open to Darwinism. More recently, someone like Muhammad Sharur offered a Qur'anic interpretation distinguishing insan rational man from Bashar biological human.
So Adam wasn't the first biological human?
In Sharur's view, no. Adam represents God selecting a pre-existing hominid, Bashar, and breathing his spirit into him, transforming him into insan, a being capable of reason and responsibility. It's an interpretive way to reconcile the text with science.
But today the backlash is strong. Creationism, Harun Yahya.
Very strong, yes. Figures like Harun Yahya, who notably isn't a scientist, are very influential. He largely recycles arguments from American Christian creationists.
Like the thermodynamics proves evolution wrong argument, or proteins forming randomly is impossible.
Those kinds of arguments, yeah. And a common tactic is quoting scientists completely out of context to make it seem like they doubt evolution, which is deeply misleading.
So Guessoum's position is
that evolution is a solid scientific theory. It's not inherently atheistic, and a theologically sound version theistic evolution is perfectly possible and can be developed within the Islamic tradition itself. Accepting the science doesn't mean abandoning faith.
Okay, so weaving all this together, history, challenges, science, faith, how do we move forward? What are the recommendations for a better dialogue?
Well, one tricky area is miracles. How do we understand them in a scientific age? Interestingly, surveys show belief in miracles is widespread, even among doctors.
The Quran uses the word signs more often, right? Ayat bayinat.
It does. Scholar Rachid Ghannouchi makes a useful distinction. Micro-miracles, God's subtle actions in everyday life, like maybe the healing properties of honey, and macro-miracles, big historical events or revelation itself.
And even those macro miracles, like the Red Sea parting, could potentially be understood scientifically through chaos theory or QM.
Potentially, yes. The idea isn't to disprove the miracle, but to understand how God might act within the natural laws he created. A tiny, precise, divine nudge, triggering a large effect via the butterfly effect, perhaps.
Like the computer game analogy you mentioned, the developer acting within the game's rules.
Exactly. God establishing the laws of nature, but still being able to act purposefully within them. It allows for divine action without demanding constant suspension of natural law.
What about prayer? Science and prayer?
That's another complex intersection. Studies on prayer efficacy are notoriously difficult and often inconclusive. Herbert Benson's work on the relaxation response and remembered wellness shows the mind-body connection is powerful.
But the deep theological question is still how God might respond or act.
Right. Is it through those subtle QM or chaos theory pathways? Is it a more holistic influence? These are deep theological waters.
A really crucial recommendation seems to be around education.
Absolutely critical, especially teaching the philosophy and history of science. Guessoum highlights how badly lacking this is in much of the Arab Muslim world.
And that lack leads to historical myths, like Copernicus supposedly stealing ideas from Muslims or seeing Western science as just plagiarism.
Yes, those kinds of unfounded claims arise partly from a poor understanding of how science actually developed historically, with contributions from many cultures. Rigorous, balanced history of science education is vital.
And engaging the religious scholars themselves.
Essential. Convincing them that science has valid things to say, even on topics traditionally seen as purely religious territory. And showing that religions themselves often need to adapt their understanding in light of new knowledge, or risk becoming irrelevant.
Finally, collaboration seems key.
Definitely. More dialogue, more joint projects between Muslim and Western thinkers working on these science and religion issues. Guessoum points to initiatives like Science and the Spiritual Quest as successful models, breaking down barriers.
So wrapping this deep dive up, we've journeyed through history, tackled modern challenges, explored different views on science and faith, drawing heavily on Guessoum's insights.
Yeah, it really highlights the richness of the Islamic intellectual tradition, but also the very real hurdles today. But Guessoum's core message is one of hope that a harmonious synthesis isn't just possible, it's vital.
It's about moving beyond seeing them as enemies, towards seeing them as potentially complementary ways of understanding reality.
Exactly. From conflict to complementarity.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. What kind of world could we create if we genuinely embrace the rigor of science and the richness of tradition together?
If concepts like the metaphysical underpinnings of science, or that Islamic idea of task here, the universe being prepared for us, truly informed both our scientific work and our spiritual lives.
What new perspectives might open up? It suggests that maybe an intellectually open, creative approach, drawing from both wells, is the only real path forward for individuals and for societies. Something to think about.